master. And if you did anything to interfere with it, you were committing a federal crime. Now here, I said I'm in the confusion business. If we judge those, including Lincoln, who supported this law, by the Christian standard that we must treat others as we would be treated, that law and everybody who supported it fails the test. But if we judge them by the consequences of the law, that the law woke up anti-slavery feeling in the North, radicalized the North in many respects, and, since we have the advantage of hindsight, bought essentially a 10-year truce period, during which time the North was able to consolidate its industrial strength, deepen its connections to the western part of the country, so that when the compromise finally collapsed, I won't go into all the reasons it collapsed, the North was in a position to win that war. Think about how, and Ed pointed this out, it wasn't really till 1864 that the outcome of that war was clear. Think about how it would have gone if there had been a secession in 1850. It's one of those questions about history that nobody can answer because it didn't happen. But it's not clear to me that there would have even been the will to resist the secession in the North of 1850, and the South might have broken off and created a slave-based empire that spread into Mexico, into the Caribbean, into Cuba. So in a paradoxical and mind-scrambling kind of way, this compromise, which was at the expense of black people, as so many compromises have been in our history, turned out to be a significant step toward their ultimate emancipation. So you can wrestle with those kinds of questions. I'm not here to answer them for you. I am here to say that these are, in my view, the kinds of questions that inevitably swirl around Abraham Lincoln. And this is one of the reasons I think he's a figure of such enduring fascination. He was a much greater man than any of us. But he was also a representative man, in that he was struggling with difficult moral problems. How do you reconcile two goods in this case? The good of the abolition of slavery, which he fervently wished and prayed for, and the good of the preservation of the Union, which he believed would ultimately be the instrument for the abolition of slavery. How do you reconcile those two? We all have problems like that in our lives, when we're torn between two valuable commitments and we can't reconcile them. And Mr. Lincoln, because he wrestled as he did, was, of course, as you all know, surrounded by people on his left who said, you're going much too slowly in your attack on slavery, and people on his right who said, you have a secret plan for stealing the property from the slave owners. And, you know, there he was, and the middle was a very lonely place. Now, is there a denouement or a resolution to this story? The truth of the matter is, of course, as we know, there is. They didn't know it in 1850. He didn't know it in 1855 when he wrote that letter to Joshua Speed. He didn't want it to come. You all know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the war, which came upon his, the secession came upon his election, and then the firing on Fort Sumter, and there was a moment when the nation held its breath, wondering whether there would be a military response. And as you know, when Mr. Lincoln called up 75,000 volunteers, 4 more states joined the Confederacy, and the war was on. Now, he didn't want it. He did everything to resist it, but it came, and one of the things it did was this is a kind of maybe odd way to put it, it solved the fugitive slave problem. You all know, probably, I'll tell it very briefly, the story of General Benjamin Butler put in charge of Fortress Monroe at Hampton Roads, Virginia, May 1861, just a month into the conflict, and 3 slaves show up at the fort, say, we want in. We don't. They're building fortifications here, and they're going to attack you from there. We don't want to work for them. We want to work for you, and we understand that you believe in compensation. So General Butler let them in, didn't really know what to do. General Butler was no abolitionist. He had voted repeatedly for Jefferson Davis at the Democratic Convention. But he was a military man. His job was to prevail over the enemy. So these 3 slaves show up, and the next day or maybe 2 days later, a guy under a flag of truce shows up and says, I understand that you have 3 slaves belonging to my employer, Colonel Mallory, and he'd like them back. And General Butler says, well, I don't think so. And the representative of Colonel Mallory, and these guys knew each other. They had some friendly chat, and the guy said, now, do I understand you to say that you're not going to honor the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and you're not going to return these slaves? And General Butler, God bless him, says, well, as far as I know, it was yesterday, the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, declared itself a foreign country. And the Fugitive Slave Law has nothing to do with a foreign country, so get out of my fort. It's a bit of a paraphrase, but that's pretty close. And that was the opening wedge. And Butler was very proud of it. He wanted to get credit for that. He was the one who decided that fugitive slaves could be treated as contraband of war.
Wow.
That is, an asset to the enemy that we wish to relieve the enemy of and deploy for ourselves. So the logic of the war itself created hundreds of thousands of fugitive slaves. I keep alluding to Ed's talk. Ed reminded us last night that fugitive slaves were, not just fugitive slaves, but also free blacks, were seized by Lee's advancing army en route to Gettysburg, and in his wonderful book, Thin Light of Freedom, hair-raising book to read, he describes how on the retreat from Gettysburg, Lee's army treated with unimaginable brutality the fugitive slaves who were desperately trying to find some place of safety between these 2 armies. So the war created hundreds of thousands of fugitive slaves, and it became pretty clear pretty quickly that it was morally and also practically unthinkable that these human beings would be returned into slavery to their owners. As we watch Lincoln take stock of what the war is doing, it's one of the great dramatic stories in our history, in all of human history, how his thinking advances to places where it hadn't been before. The dogmas of the quiet past, he said famously in a message to Congress,